Welcome to Strength Chat Podcast, presented by Kabuki Strength. Introducing your hosts, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength, Rudy Cadlow, mature athlete and coach, and the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen.
Welcome to Strength Chat with your host, Chris Duffin, the mad scientist of strength. To my right, our mature athlete and coach, Dr. Rudolph. And to my left, the wizard of training himself, Brandon Sen. So today, we are really excited to have on Ian King of King Sports International down in Australia. So Ian has been in the coaching game. He's the coach's coach, as he's called by some, for quite some time, and actually he's one of the guys that brought a lot of science to strength training, or publicized a lot of that with a lot of discussions early on in the 80s and 90s, and a lot of stuff that we follow today. So I met Ian recently at the Swiss Symposium in Toronto, and my first experience with Ian, we're standing there having a conversation, and in the middle of the conversation, Ian stops and he says, I don't want to, insult you or anything, but here's some observations I have on your posture. And it was great because there were things that I knew and I was aware of, but one, nobody would ever tell me that, and two, most people would never even be able to identify that just standing there and we're just a couple minutes into conversation. So a great deal of respect for the content that he's published, how he's been involved in the athletic world for quite some time. And I guess we can actually let's kick it off. Just a little bit of background about yourself. Ian, how'd you get involved in the position that you're in today, and how has King Sports International evolved?
Yeah, appreciate Chris, and it was great to meet you, as you said, in Toronto. So I grew up on an island in the Pacific Ocean, and a really rare thing happened to me. There was probably only one strongman in the entire South Pacific Ocean. I happened to meet him, and this was in the mid-1960s. So you can imagine back in those days, there weren't too many people who were serious about their strength training. So I had this rare coincidence of meeting the local strongman, and he took me under his wing and he took me into the local gymnasium, which obviously wasn't much in those days, and that really triggered off an interest in formal training, where I was already immersed in a culture where we played sport all day long. That's what you do in islands where you've got no TV and no other distractions. But I had this rare opportunity to learn about strength training in the mid-60s. So from there, I realised we really didn't know what we were doing. So I went to boarding school in Australia in the 70s. I was pretty excited about that because I thought the Australians would know what they were doing. And I got there, and they really didn't know what they were doing. But the good thing about it, at least in the 70s, that they were humble enough to say, "Listen, we really don't know what we're doing." So I thought I'll go to university and study this stuff because surely they'll know what they're doing. And I went to university in the early 80s, and they were still, I guess, humble enough to say, we really don't know. In fact, I was a weird guy who studied strength training, and they thought I was a bit of an outlier. I never forget the day the head exercise physiology professor said, "Ian, I've got these magazines, they're 1980, 1978, 79, 1980 magazines. I don't really have any interest in them. They're called the National Strength Coaches Association magazines. Would you like to have them?" So I've just had a really fortunate track of being exposed to fairly significant moments, and also significant in the development of the industry, because I got to see the 60s, the 70s, the 80s, and I've seen quite a few decades. So but my interest is not purely in strength training per se, because I come from a sporting background and I work with athletes. So what I've been able to do is been able to take smart strength training into sport and enhance athletic performance with that.
You mean getting stronger does help with sport?
Well, that's an interesting thing, because you've got to have some sort of compassion, some empathy, because I've sat and talked to coaches who introduced strength training in the 50s and 60s, and they introduced them using pretty shitty training methods, and they didn't work. And that's fair enough. I mean, can you imagine you're a basketball coach and you introduce your team to some bodybuilding methods, and all of a sudden their shooting goes off? You can understand how I think there was an embracing and then a moving away and then coming back. And it's been a slow road back. But the irony for me is that it was an acceptance of science in strength training of the 1990s that really put strength training on the map. But despite that, I think we've actually moved further away from optimal. Despite the fact that we've now got acceptance. I mean, there isn't an athlete on the planet who doesn't do strength training anymore. But having said that, I actually think that we've headed in an inappropriate direction, and perhaps it would have been better off back in the 80s, where only those people who really were passionate and understood strength training were teaching it. rather than anybody with a certificate in their hand, but that's another story.
No, actually, that's a good story. Let's head down that track a little bit, Ian. So, because I see a lot of that myself. People that, and this relates to a story. Actually, I think Donnie Thompson gave me the background that you had been training athletes for like 18 years before you published your first paper. I may have the numbers off right now, but
No, he's exactly right.
but there's so many people out there that have like a year or two of like lifting under their experience, and they want to be a coach, and they just don't have the knowledge, the expertise, the experience. And but what else do you see like in our current environment that is not appropriate? Like you were saying, you see a lot of things where maybe we're not moving in the right direction. So what is it that you're seeing?
Well, let's start with the kids. And you can travel the world and you can watch dryland or strength training for kids or off-court training, physical preparation, call it what you want. You can see, and they're almost all doing the same thing. They're all singing from the same hymn sheet. I was standing beside a pool yesterday, and I was watching a group of between 8 and 12 doing stuff, and I was just mentally ticking off in my mind, would that exercise make their injury potential greater or worse? And so everything they were doing was basically, I'll put it in inverted commas, performance enhancing. So people think, okay, they use their lats and their chest in the pool and their legs, so we've got to strengthen those up, and that's really sweet. But there's one problem with sport. Sport creates imbalances in the body. The primary goal of physical preparation should be to correct the imbalances produced by the sport so you can play your sport for longer. Now, if that simple point is missed, and it is missed by the world, they go and say, okay, we need to enhance their performance. They use their chest and their lats. Let's do some more chest and lats. These kids are now having surgery before they hit 20. Very few of them will be in the sport at the age of 20. So the simple concept of, we actually want to negate the downside of your sport as our primary in our dryland training, not make the problems worse. And that's probably one of the biggest points that's missed, and how that's missed in an era where we're 20 years past the science acceptance of strength training. It's not a big rap on the industry.
Yep, and that relates exactly to what your observations were when you saw me, because there was some pelvic tilt. There's some things going on that is very common in high level strength athletes, right? Because they've got a high level of posterior chain development. Now we've got that pelvis rotation. We're going to wear out those hips early. We're going to have higher risk for back injuries, like those same sort of things. But if I continue to develop that without balancing my body, I'm going to limit, my career as an athlete, right? And that's, your observations were exactly on point, and that's a really important thing to grasp.
So you strength and conditioning coaches think that they're the reason why athletes succeed. They're not the reason why athletes succeed. For the most part, they're the reason why athletes fail these days. The athletes succeed because they're really, really good at what they do, and they really love what they do. Our goal in physical preparation is to give them their gifted, to extend their gift, not to deny them their gift and take it away from their gift. So, this is a message that if we could get across to the world will be a better place.
That's like a cornerstone. One of our messages that we try to deliver is we want people to live better through strength, and that's really important. Is that strength training can actually be a very positive influence, but a lot of times we see it not be that way, and it ends up being detrimental to people over the course of their career, their life, whatever. And it doesn't have to be if you can assess and assign it appropriately. And that's what I said. We beat the home that point all the time about, you can live better through strength, but you got to know how to do it.
Well, there's a school of thought that specificity of training is key for many sports. What I hear you saying is, you have to specifically train for that sport, but if you don't supplement that, if you do not get a more general physical preparedness, that specificity could come back to bite you.
Well and truly, and not just in the strength, but obviously in technical, tactical, and psychological development. But the acceleration of the degeneration of the body that's occurring in sport globally at the moment is a disgrace. And there's a duty of care that's been completely ignored. And I've never been one to make too many friends, and that's not been my focus, because I'm seeing stuff that people aren't seeing, but in 10 years' time they'll see. And they'll look back hopefully and change, but there'll be a whole generation of athletes who've lost their life quality because people just weren't thinking. They weren't using the God-given brain.
Yeah, I mean and a lot of it is coaches that are trying to demonstrate their performance, right? So they want the most out of that athlete right now, not necessarily anything that's going to extend that athlete's career, and certainly not
Hmm.
looking at like, okay, now how are we going to actually prep this athlete for their life after their career is over, right? And those are. Go ahead, Ian.
And that's a challenge with the industry of strength, in that because the segmentation of thinking in the Western world, the strength coach says, okay, if I can increase their strength lifts, I've done my job. There's a complete ignorance of the fact that, well, they're actually less athletic than they were. They've got more injuries, their career's shorter, and their stats are worse. So we're really missing the point on how to help an athlete. My goal, if I spend 5 minutes with a person, I want to extend their career by years. That's my simple goal. So if I helped you go to your first Olympics, I want to see you at 4 more after that. So it's really possible if we change our focus, and it's not about the numbers in the gym unless it's your sport.
Yep. Yeah, we see that a lot. One of our friends is four-time Olympian Reese Hoffa, and he competes against a lot of guys that bench press more than him, squat more than him, but he's able to generate more power and been able to beat a lot of those guys that are one taller, better leverages, and stronger. It's even though those guys are pushing bigger numbers in the gym. So, he's got it back down and he's working on his explosiveness and working on things that are going to carry over appropriately to his squat or to his shot put. And he's been able to have a long career because of that. And now he's able to now start transitioning into coaching as he moves to the next phase because, I don't think he's got 5 Olympic cycles in him. There's a point of
Yeah,
like, we passed that point, right?
exactly.
So you've been working with Olympic athletes since, I guess, 1988, maybe 8 Olympic cycles in 20 some different sports. Is there a commonality in your training and teaching philosophy that goes across 20 sports, or do you analyze each sport vertically and come up with specific training programs?
Yeah, I think there's accuracy in both those statements. There's a commonality, obviously, and you'll see a pattern. Anyone studying how I work with people will see the pattern. But one of the key things I think is how you treat the athlete, because we rate ourselves a bit too highly. We have to sit back and appreciate the culture of the sport, the nuances of the sport, but at the same time have the courage to introduce new things into the sport. So it's a pretty fine balance, and most people don't successfully merge across. And I'm up to in excess of 30 sports at the elite level. You rarely get that success in merging them because you get too defined in one culture. Like if I had say a basketball background, I'd turn up in the Reebok pumps from the 80s, and I'd in my zip up tracksuit pants, and I'd be chewing gum, and I'd be walking like a brother. To relate to so many different sports, you've really got to be humble and acknowledge you to the athlete. Listen, I really don't know that much about your sport, but I'll learn, and by the way, I'll do the best I can for you. So there's definitely commonalities, but to successfully do what I do, which is help athletes in all sports, I think there's some unique traits.
So Ian, you've obviously worked with athletes at the highest level, and we're talking kind of along the lines of long-term development and seeing those athletes be successful even past that. What does the actual building model look like, in your opinion, all the way from youth to that highest level? One of the biggest things that we see here in America is the early specialization of sport. So, a lot of times the parents of the little leaguer are having them play baseball all year. They're playing summer league, they're playing their actual in season, and then whether or not they get burnt out or that's raises a higher risk of injury is probably up for debate. But what do you see in terms of, in your opinion, what that early developmental model looks like?
So what's happened in sport over the last few decades is that adult training has been brought down through the ages. There'll be strength and conditioning coaches at kindergarten in a few years' time. They've already got CrossFit for kids sort of stuff. So we're seeing what I call flawed adult programs being overlaid on children. And, there was a time when strength and conditioning was applied when someone reached about the age of 20, and then they blew out at about the age of 30, and everyone thought that was just aging, when it was probably as much what they were doing. Now they're doing that same crap with them at the age of 10, and they're blowing out at the age of between 15 and 20. So there's a few things that need to be understood. Multi-year development, and Isfan Bayi from Canada obviously has had a great contribution in this area, is that you have to decide what sport I'm going to peak in, when I'm going to peak in it, and which sports will contribute to that. So unless you're in an early specialisation sport, there's no need to specialise early. The challenge for parents and kids and coaches now is what they call the pathways of selection are happening earlier and earlier, so they feel obliged to do that. But if you can delay that specialisation, as you've said, that's fantastic. But the other thing that I think is probably missed in America, everyone's blaming early specialisation for the incidence of injuries. The incidence of injuries are simply because the training is imbalanced, not just because it's specialised. But from a movement development point of view, there are a few key sports I'd like to see athletes involved in. I like to see them in hand-eye coordination, foot-eye coordination. I like to see them in spatial awareness sports. So we're talking about things like a martial arts or a dance. We're talking about soccer. We're talking about a throwing. We're talking about a ballet or a gymnastics. We're talking about half a dozen key sports I like to see. And I like to see an athlete be a multi-sport athlete for as long as they feel they can be. But, that alone is not going to save them from injuries. The fact that we're delaying the specialisation is not the reason they're getting injured. They're getting injured because we're introducing either too much volume, but more specifically, too much off-court training, like strength and conditioning, which is really crappy stuff, what's being done to them.
Yeah, how much of that, long-term injury prevention do you think is actual environmental changes that need to happen, or is that even an option? Is the environmental, situation of the school, or maybe technological factors that are coming on? Everyone has their face in their phone, and kids these days are on their phones all day. Even just a few years ago when I was a teenager, there was. I didn't have a cell phone, and now everybody does, even in, middle school and elementary school. Do you think those are things that can be addressed in the movement side of things?
There are definitely issues, and the quality of stock is declining. I mean, we're going to the islands and plundering the islanders to get the stock, and even then, they're starting to eat McDonald's and play Nintendo sort of thing. So the athletic stock is definitely declining, but I don't put that as the pure limiting factor. If you apply a shitty strength program to any athlete at any age, they are going to implode. And that's what we're seeing. We just don't understand the role of physical preparation in sport. We don't understand, the fundamentals of flexibility. I mean, if you miss the point about flexibility, you're basically shooting yourself in the foot or the knee or the shoulder, whichever joint you want to blow out. So there's quite a few fundamentals that we're just missing that I feel just aren't being recognised, and there will be one day. But I say, what about this generation?
Yeah, we talked to Keller Starrett a few weeks ago, and he had some thoughts on this. One of his he's involved in a stand-up kids program, which is essentially takes some of the desks and chairs out of schools and puts them in a more active environment. One of his big thoughts that needed to happen in the future was actually having roles of physical preparation coaches or actual trained strength coaches in those earlier developmental years. So, more often than not, it's just going to be the PE teacher is the baseball coach, the football coach, and so forth. And one of his thoughts was that we needed to have actual defined positions for those people to actually be successful with this, some of these issues that we're seeing. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I got to be straight on this one. I get scared when I see a program that's got a strength and conditioning coach in it, because I'll go back a little bit. In the 1980s, when I started out professionally, I inherited kids 18 and upwards that had never done any physical preparation before, and they were clean skins. Now, into the 90s, that started to change, especially around mid-90s in Australia, but obviously earlier in America. Now, all I do is inherit broken bodies. I just get broken bodies. And I think it's not how early in the age that they start training them, it's the quality of the training they give them. And without wanting to offend anybody, the lower funded programs would not normally get the highest qualified people. Having said that, I don't think the professionals are that sharp at what they do anyway. But my concern is the lower we take down structured, adult thinking, physical preparation, the more we de-athleticize and wreck our kids. So I agree that we've moved away from play and physical education, but I'd be I probably aren't rushing to endorse structured and not the classical strength and conditioning. Because listen, the average strength and conditioning coach is brain dead. And I'm not going to make too many friends, I get it. But if I'll go to a convention, I'll see what everyone else is doing, and they'll do that. I could go to any physical preparation program in the world, just about, as long as they're connected to the internet, and I could take a blindfold off. Within 30 seconds, I could say, yeah, they're cutting edge, and that's inverted commas, cutting edge. That means they're doing the same shit as everyone else is. They're not thinking. So it's really time for us to start thinking. The only advancements we've seen in strength and conditioning in the last 20 years, 30 years is in technology. We can measure the time motion analysis better, but have our training methods really improved? I don't think so. And if you ever look at our injury incidents, it's gone up. So yeah, I'd prefer to see kids play than have an adult with a piece of paper. I'm a strength and conditioning coach running a program for them, but so I guess I'm just a little bit retro. Maybe I'm showing my age a little bit.
So no, this is a good discussion, and it's one that I think is really important. As in, because what we're doing ourselves with our, we see the same thing. If we get people in fresh, we can have them, spend 15 minutes, have them squatting beautifully, moving well. We get somebody, which is most people that have been training for a while, and it takes 6 months to retool them because they've got all these injuries, broken patterns, and the way we do our work is we teach those core lifts almost as like a bit of physical therapy, and how we cue them and teach basically how we create tension and load, tension in the body in preparation for load. And if we do that appropriately, a lot of the right things happen. The right things turn on, the right things turn off, and we do it in the right sequence. But how do we have an impact on the strength and conditioning world as a whole to help get those practices, the education, the thinking, that sort of up? Because I've been into the high schools and seen like some of the stuff that's happening, and it's like, no wonder the colleges are getting broken people, and then by the time they move to pro sports, it's even worse, and so on. And I'm starting to see, we've been to a number of, working with a number of newer strength and conditioning coaches moving into the colleges, and they're really starting to embrace, some of the impact of good quality movement and how we achieve it. But they're almost fighting against the upper levels that have been in it for the last 20, 30 years going, well, that's not how we've done it. That's not how we've done it. And, but I'm hoping that, as another generation rolls, or another one, how do we impact the generation that's coming up now so that the next generation isn't where we're at right now?
Well, you raised it. I'm going to be pretty controversial. As I said, making friends isn't my forte. If we continue allowing regulation through dominant professional organisations to dictate education to our industry, they will continue to get fed commercially biased information. So at this point, I
definitely see that.
If I could say, the only thing that's going to fly at many mainstream educational programs is that which are the products and the services provided by their primary sponsors. So the industry is being educated on the basis of the commercial interests of the bigger companies. Now, that's a statement that obviously not too many people would have thought about, and many would they'd shoot the messenger pretty quickly on that one.
No, I mean, it's a fact that one of our largest gym chains actually owns a lot of the certification programs here in the U.S. That's a fact.
I can tell you, the only reason people were allowed to know about tissue manipulation through a foam roller and other devices is when one of the dominant NSCA sponsors worked out how they could distribute them. Before then, there was no discussion on that subject. Now, one of the reasons strength training is not talked about is because, I don't need to buy an equipment to lie on the ground and stretch. So the world's not going to change until we change the power of control of information. And I'm really quite heartened, and I'll be more controversial about the recent US election, because, the corporatocracy of America and the political system is one where you can only hear what, the companies who are funding the major political parties want you to hear. And we may have just seen a movement to break that cycle. So I see that as hope. And I see things like what Ken Kanakin's doing. Like, we go up to Swiss and Ken doesn't say, listen, Ian, you can't talk about that because it's offending my major sponsor. In fact, he to go back a step further than that, he would be picking his speakers based on who the major sponsors want to be speaking. So, if we support organisations that are free from commercial bias in their education, we have a hope. If we don't, we'll continue throwing our children out there to be collateral damage for this really crappy content that's being provided in commercial interests.
Now, and we have a number of highly educated, I'm using quotation marks here, people show up to our seminars and they're like, man, I learned more in the 3 days about how the body operates under load than in the last 2 years or 4 years of like time I spent in school. We didn't learn this stuff, and that's pretty crazy that we, because it's not that complex, right, Ian? I mean, it's
real simple.
It really is not that complex.
But you can't get a textbook into a university unless you go through certain channels. So, when I was at university in the 80s, there was no books. If you were going to, when I say no books, you weren't too many strength books. But the stuff that I was expected to study from at university, I mean, some of the theories that were being taught in then were just so far off pace, and I think they've gone even further off pace, because the selection of the textbook is determined by who's buddy with who's, etc. So, but it is simple. It's really simple, and we knew enough 30 years ago. I mean, when Reg Spark wandered the streets of England in post-war, or in South Africa, or even took a photo shoot at Waikiki Beach with Diamond Head in the background in 1949, you could see that we knew enough about strength training in the 40s. We haven't really progressed that much across the board from a collective point. Yeah, the way I have in some disciplines like lifting, but we haven't collectively moved that far.
So, can you give us, just for our listeners, like, I think we're a lot on the same page here as like what we know kind of what we're talking about here, but can you give us some examples or some specifics of exactly like some of the things that are wrong or what's being taught incorrectly?
Yeah, or maybe by a sport, for example.
Yep.
Chris and I attended a DNS throwing seminar, I think it was down in San Diego last year. And it was interesting because there are a lot of baseball people there. And I know you're playing baseball in Australia. And what was interesting there is a lot of the strength and conditioning coaches that are baseball working for some of the Major League Baseball teams expressed their frustration with the managers and coaches who wouldn't adopt some of the things they were teaching because they're old school and
Right.
they just said we don't want our pitchers lifting weights or whatever.
Yeah. Or they don't care that they're getting a bunch of Tommy John surgeries. If as long as that pitcher can throw fast right now and for the next season, that's all I care. And they're trying to embrace some of the movement principles and stuff like that. So let's
stick with baseball, for example. If you could use that and say, okay, what's happening with, say, the strength and conditioning coaches that are coaching baseball players that is incorrect? What specifically should they be doing differently than what they're doing now?
You picked a great example because I have a lot of sympathy for the shoulder of the thrower. Their range of movement, their speed of movement is phenomenal. Now, if we mess with that at all, like if we understand the shoulder joint, as soon as we mess with the position of that shoulder joint at all, you will get into trouble. The shoulder joint is incredibly unforgiving. The shoulder joint, because it's such a 360-degree joint, the minute you aggravate it at all, it goes into protective mode. And then if we keep training on that, we're fighting the protective mechanisms and we're making it worse. So the shoulder has to be kept really healthy. Now, that doesn't mean it needs heaps of strength training. In fact, I also think that some of the loading that's been exposed to is inappropriate. The first thing you should be doing in throwing is, first of all, understanding optimal joint positioning and then maintaining it. Now, if you're in a sport that throws in a typical unilateral manner, you're in the worst sport at all. Like if you think powerlifting is a challenge, it's a bilateral sport. If you're in a unilateral, high-volume sport like throwing, you're in a world of hurt. I say this, for every time you throw a ball forwards, are you throwing a ball backwards? I'm not suggesting you do, but that's the sort of thing that you have to consider to ensure balance. So let's say you don't get to the bloke until he's done 50 throws. What about 1,000 throws? What about you don't get to him until he's done 50,000 throws? It's almost gets in the too hard basket. So my attitude is the earlier we get to them and help them understand how to maintain optimal joint position, the better. Now, that optimal joint position doesn't just come from strength training. It comes from the three things that determine joint health. It comes from length, tension, and stability, which is a form of joint strength. And if we can balance those three things out and negate the impact of throwing, then we've got a chance. Now, I'm not interested in high-level strength until you show me a healthy joint. If you strengthen an unhealthy joint, you're making the problem worse.
Yep.
So the keys for throwers or any high-volume unilateral sport, including tennis, etc., is that we've got to get to them early. We've got to teach them how to look after their joint, and then we've got to progress them along the way because they are in one of the most demanding body sports in terms of that joint. That joint doesn't have much to hurt. And how do we monitor it? We be objective about our injury stats. We say, listen, Let's collect injury stats. How are we going? Are we getting better or getting worse? Because no one wants to collect injury stats. They're all scared of it. They're not facing the reality. We've got a scoreboard, and then we've got an injury stats, the man games lost stats. They're the two things that we need to take into account.
So, in those injuries, and what do you think the biggest issue is with that? Do you think it's consistent loading? Do you think it's poor identification of movement to begin with, or is it some combination of the two? We tend to, especially in powerlifting, it is it's a very simple sport in that the movements are, the bench, squat, and deadlift. In throwing, it's predominantly one movement over and over and over, and like you said, you don't give the necessary attention to the other areas. So in terms of injury prevention or injury improvement, do you see it as more of a matter of loading, or do you think it's more of a combination of identification of movement qualities early on?
So it can be a combination of any of those depending upon the individual. But the most important thing is this: how much volume can that joint withstand under the current circumstances? The current circumstances include the technique that they're using and their genetics. Everybody's different. Now, someone might be able to throw X number of throws a week. Someone might be able to throw a lot more. But the minute you overload that threshold, no matter how good your dry land training is, you're in trouble. So it's important to understand the work capacity of the human based upon their genetics and their throwing style. Now, as far as throwing style goes, everybody in sport starts out with a solution that can change as they get stronger. And that's something that we can work with. But the bottom line is it's a lack of recognition of our work capacity threshold. Now, if we look back at the Golden State last year, they set the record. They beat the Bulls record in the number of games won during the season, but they lost the playoffs. So, there's a possibility that maybe if they'd rested a little bit more, they would have been fresher for the end result. There's a few things there. But what I'm saying is everybody's got a threshold. A human's got a threshold. And if you don't understand what that threshold is, you will exceed it. Now, in pro sport, most people don't care because I'll get their blood today and don't worry about it tomorrow. That's why the athlete has got to be their best own protector. And our job is to help the athlete make better decisions to protect their future, because the coach isn't. There's nobody else other than the athlete who cares enough about the athlete other than themselves. And I teach them, that's my number one goal, is to teach an athlete to make the best decisions for themselves. It's not easy, especially in team sports, because there's so many compliance in team sports, so they're people pleasers. So I hope I've addressed that in terms of understanding the capacity, the work, and it's not the same. Genetically, some people can handle load more than others, and so that's the tough decision. The coach says, "Well, we're all going to throw 1,000 throws this week." Well, no, that bloke might throw 50, and that bloke might throw 2,000. You've got to really individualize the approach.
Yeah, what do you use for? And I know we have answers for how we do it, but in that instance, taking a throw, for example. What indicators do you use to try to understand what that individual's work capacity is?
Yep. I'm pretty old school, and I'm not a big fan of the technology, because one thing to use technology, but then how do you interpret it? So my attitude is pretty simple. The body is really good at giving messages. And you ask your body, you ask the athlete, get them in touch with their body. How's the joint feeling? How's the throw feeling? Because they'll know, is my velocity coming up? Is my velocity coming down? And if you can teach them to monitor how their joints feeling, how their throat's feeling, they'll know when they're rising and falling. And there's a lot of warning signs before injury. There's a lot of warning signs to tell you, hey, that's enough throwing for today.
It seems there's a little bit of counterculture going on here in our society, as in Australia too. I mean, the emphasis on winning is so important and coaches pushing athletes to get out there and get beyond their limits, and many athletes are afraid to admit they've got a pain in their shoulder or a pain in their legs because they don't want to be pulled out of the lineup. They don't want to be thought of as a pussy, all of the natural. So, I mean, do you see that a lot? I mean, how does an athlete honestly say to his coach, I think I'm overworked right now, and not feel like he's going to be booted to the second string or booted off the team?
Yeah. So what I teach them is, this is the only time I really get into that little bit at seed. And I call it the Ili Tambur book of excuses. And this was, I credit this to an island boy that I worked with, a Fijian boy. He's a phenomenal athlete, played probably into his 40s. And when he knew he wasn't right to train, he'd come up with a different story. He'd say, Ian, my hamstring is a bit sore. And big smile on his face. It's fantastic. So unfortunately, to preserve the athlete, they've got to get really good at coming up with a lot of stories. And mix them up a bit. Now, I know I'm sounding really deceitful, but I'm really interested in the athlete's longevity more than anything else. So if they're in that situation, if they're a complier, if they're a people pleaser, they're stuffed. They may as well quit now, so to speak. But if they're willing to use their imagination and find a few ways to dodge and weave, then they've got a chance. Then they've got it. Because unless they're cleaned up before they enter that environment, they're stuffed. And that's why I like to give athletes as long as insurance as I can. But it'll take, even someone like myself quite a few years to get an athlete in a position where they can sustain a tough environment for a while. I've seen it time and time again where I've had an athlete in beautiful condition and 3 months later they're injured and out of the game. So the athletes has to learn preservation strategies, full stop. And if they're not prepared to what I call run two agendas, which is a coach agenda and their agenda, then there's not a lot of hope for them.
Yeah, I mean, there's simply two things that lead to an injury, right? I mean, we've got adding load to poor movement quality to begin with, or pushing past our work capacity into a fatigue standpoint. Mm-hmm. I mean, right? This is how we end up with an injury, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and certainly a big responsibility is on the coach to help identify that. And I got to imagine it's a skill for that athlete to learn, how their body's responding to things. It's something that, everyone in this room here is an athlete in their own respect. And I know it can be incredibly challenging for all of us to say, today we need to slow it down a little bit, or, maybe we need to take a restoration period. Because, with an athlete, a lot of the times all they can see is the immediate. It's very challenging for them to see, how is this going to lead into future progress, or, is this it? Is this how I'm going to be forever? So is there any strategies that you've taken?
I just got to break in because this gentleman here, stating this stuff right now, he just did a meet last weekend, and he walks into the gym a couple days later and decides he's going to go for a PR deadlift in a fatigue state. And it didn't work out too well for him. So,
bad. That was a really bad decision. I didn't post that to Instagram for a reason. So Ian, is there any strategies that you've taken with your athletes or even with coaches in teaching them how to identify those areas outside of, we can look at the metrics, you've thrown 50,000 pitches, you've thrown 100 pitches. Is there any other metrics or things that you can teach the athlete or coach to help them identify those areas?
So what I teach is a real simple concept, and it goes like this. We need a rational person, we need an emotional person. So the emotional person is the person that says, I'm going to do this, and I'm going to beat that person, and I'm going to lift more than I've ever lifted before. And you don't want to lose that emotional. You don't want to lose it. But here's the problem. If you've got two emotional people make a decision all the time, you're stuffed. So if you look at the coaches spend their entire life wondering when they're going to get sacked next. Like they're just living in fear as to whether or not they're going to have a job next year. And you've got to expect them to be pretty emotional in their decision making. It's pretty rare to see a coach stay calm and really not be too concerned. Most of them are what I call emotional thinkers, and that's okay. But then you've got to have someone in the circle who's the rational thinker. So that if you're dealing with an athlete who's a bit of an emotional thinker, then you've got to have a rational mind in the circle. And that's where it can be a training partner, it can be another lifter, or another athlete, or a coach. But just remember this, you need the emotion, you need the rational. And what I typically do to help the athlete learn is this. I'll say to them, Ian, I think I want to do this. And if I feel that that's probably not the right idea, I say, well, really? And they say, yeah. I said, okay, well, we'll see. And so short of allowing them to kill themselves, I let them find out how sharp their decision-making is. Because if they've done that and they've stuffed up a few times, and then they go to make that same poor decision again, I say, well, okay, what about the last time you came to that conclusion? And so they've learned through their own, flaws, and we all make flaws. And I tell you what, if I had an athlete who didn't have that passion, that drive, and that emotion, then you're not going to go anywhere anyway. So we don't want to deny that, we don't want to take it away, but we've just got to have it. We've got to have the rational person in the circle who's thinking it from a calm, objective perspective. If you can include that in your decision making, I'm not saying that person is always going to dominate the decision making, but at least they're there. And the more consistent they are in your presence, the more they can say, yeah, okay, Brandon, the last time you wanted to do that, what happened? Okay.
I really love that from a philosophy standpoint, the fact that you've got to be able to let people fail to learn. It's certainly something I've used around here. Isn't that right, Andre?
I was just thinking about Andre.
Well, who should that
But seriously, I mean, we do the same thing, because you gotta not worry about so much about like winning every, making sure that every decision is correct. You need to think about the development of that athlete, right? And if you can help them become sharper and become a better person, managing their stuff better, you're having an impact that's gonna, be with them 5, 10, 15, 20 years down the road. And yeah, sometimes you've got to let people fail. And
Yeah, they got to learn.
Yeah, exactly.
So in a commercially driven world where whether it's professional sports or college sports where winning is so important, and the coach is emotional because he's afraid he's going to get shit canned if he doesn't win. The player is emotional because you want him to be driven and motivated and to excel, to be the best. Where's the rationality? Who's the rational person? Should it be the strength and conditioning coach? Should it be the athletic trainer? And how do they get enough power to push back on the coach or the athlete and say it's time to take time out here?
Yeah, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter who it is, but the power balance is a real challenge. But I let them know this. In sport, let's take basketball, for example, and what we call a franchise player that the team's built around. Do you think they're compliant? Do you think they do everything the team wants to do, the coach wants to do? They don't.
No,
there are a few key players in every organisation that call their shots, and the rest of them don't even realise that's going on sometimes and think they've got to be compliant. It's really important for an athlete to understand that they can say no. And I've had athletes. I've had a rugby player sitting there in front of the national coach, and he said, "If you keep training with Ian King, you will not be selected for the World Cup." And the athlete said, "Go ahead." Mm-hmm. Now that's the sort of confidence and rationality that you want to build in on athletes so they don't get all panicky. And if they were the other way and they're, oh, geez, I better be a people pleaser, then they're stuffed. So it doesn't matter who it is. If there's always someone in there. And my challenge, if I'm in a circle like that, my challenge is how do I influence? And my strategy is typically not the coach. My strategy is to help the coach become calm. Talk about stuff that calms them down, but I don't go to them to change decisions. We manipulate them through the athlete. Now, that's just a strategy I've used over the last 3 or 4 decades, and it might seem a bit deceitful, but I create change through the athletes, with the athletes who want to take charge of some of their own decisions in their future. And as I said, if an athlete wants to be compliant, people pleaser, they're not going to last. But I can tell you what, the LeBron Jameses of the world, the Michael Jordans of the world, they weren't the most compliant people in the training environment. I can tell you that now. Having talked with the Chicago Bulls physical preparation coach during that era, Michael had his own trainer. I mean, they did their own thing, and they made decisions that were smart for them. So there's no reason why the rest of the team can't do it, but the challenge for us is to put the rational person in the environment or find out how to influence the balance of powers in that way. And that's a challenge, but you're in powerlifting, which is an individual sport, so that's a lot easier.
Yeah, and in team sports, it's tougher. I mean, you mentioned the Bulls. I know Derrick Rose was recovering from knee surgery the last couple of years, and he just got traded. But that was maybe a result of him holding himself back, and he got murdered in the press, and from the fans. But why aren't you out there with your team? And he's saying to himself, "I'm not ready." Yeah, and now he's on another team.
Yeah, at some point you have to have that relationship with your coach as well. With what we do, we're in the private sector in terms of we don't deal in, major team sports as the primary coaches. And one thing that we discuss with all of our clients who come on first time with us is that we need to have an open, transparent relationship both ways. And that's something that we put right out there. It's one of the first discussion points in our initial Skype calls is that, everything that we do is for you. We don't have any other dog in the fight. So if there's something that comes up on your end, we're not with you all the time. So we need to be able to have that discussion with you, and we need you to feel comfortable having that discussion with us. So I think that's a huge thing that needs to happen in order for, the athlete to, one, feel empowered to, stand up and raise some of their concerns, but also for the coach to say, well, I hear your concerns, but this is why we're doing it. And, maybe we can come to some type of resolution. But I think that's incredibly important, is to have that level of transparency between the athlete and coach.
And it does help, as you said, if you sat down and had a heart to heart from the outset. It doesn't always work out, but it's a good starting point.
Yeah.
Well, we're kind of bumping against time, so I'd like to make sure if we've got any last final thoughts to get those in before we kind of close this up. It's been an awesome discussion so far, Ian, so I've really enjoyed time chatting with you this afternoon, or morning in your case, right?
Yeah, it is. It's, we're ahead, but only in time.
Ian, I understand you have athletic training centers around the world. King Sports does. If someone's interested in working with King Sports, how would they go about getting a hold of you and finding out more information?
So I encourage people to start a new educational program. We have a really unique approach to education. We teach people from a practical point of view, and we help them assess their competence level as the market assesses them. So the average coach in my program has been with me for about 10 years. It's quite a lifelong opportunity if you want it, but I'd encourage you to start at the level 1 program in it's a correspondence course. It's pretty simple starting place, but it allows you to kick the tires and us to assess you. And you can get that off our internet, our website at King Sports. It's KINGSPORTS.net. And yes, one day we are going to update our site. But I recommend you start with the educational side. My attitude to if you as a coach can get empowered with your competence, my goal, my vision for coaches is that you will have an endless demand for your services, as a result of which you'll be able to raise your rates, select who you work with, work by choice, and develop other interests in life. And that's a summary that I have for coaches, because we're in an industry where people aren't too interested about competence. They're more interested about getting that certificate and feeling like they're doing what everyone else is doing. And I say, listen, forget about that stuff. Let's work on competence. So whatever that area is, find something to master. I don't care who you're mastering, just master something. And the market will tell you how you're going, because if you don't have endless demand for your services, then probably haven't travelled along the competency road too well. The competency is not just about your knowledge, which is another flaw in the industry. Everyone thinks if I go to 1,000 seminars and collect information, I'm going to be better. Competency is practically based, and it's holistic. It's not just about your knowledge and science and sets and reps. It's how you deal with people. It's how you handle your emotions, how you handle their emotions, how you make decisions, how you negotiate, how you understand people. So very holistic approach, and that's what I think makes us a little bit different in our approach to coach education.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you so much for sitting down and taking the time to chat with us today. And this I think I speak for all of us, has been a very good discussion, and I think we've all learned a little bit from it. I know our audience is going to take away quite a bit from it.
Yeah, and thank you for being a little controversial. We appreciate that.
From when I came in the 80s, and when I tell people that the aerobic base was a myth, when I tell them that 3 sets of 10 was something that DeLorme thought of 30 years ago, I mean, I guess it's just my path is not here to piss people off. But if I tell you what I think to help you, it is probably going to piss a few people off. But they'll get over it, and in fact, they'll probably publish it themselves, and everyone will love it one day. So yeah, I'm just ahead of the curve, and that's just where I was born.
Awesome. Well, hope you enjoy the rest of your day, Ian. Again, thank you very much from the team here at Kabuki Strength.
We look forward to chatting with you again.
Thanks, Ian.
It's been a pleasure, and thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.